so glad you could make it tonight on the occasion of marking this wonderful Alice Baber exhibition, Reverse Infinity. This is the first major Alice Baber exhibition in 40 years. We are so proud of this show. We have worked on this for a very, 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 very long time. Martha and I, 11 years ago, when we started this gallery, really had a process to find artists that we were interested in. And what started happening to us was that we were looking at artists that maybe were overlooked or were known in their day, and for whatever reason, were not so well known. And so we started out by looking at names on a list, but the names turned into looking at paintings. And can you imagine when we saw paintings like these? And then even further with Alice Baber, the CV in my hand is 5 pages long. This woman was really important. And so we're here tonight to celebrate Alice Baber. We have this wonderful panel of guests. I'm going to introduce them now. So grateful to Dan Cameron, who wrote the essay for our catalog. It's the first major book on Alice Baber in a long time. It's 72 pages. You can take a look up at the front. Let me read you more about Dan, our moderator. Dan Cameron is a curator of contemporary art who also writes about art, teaches, and gives lectures about art. He makes art, serves on art-related juries and boards, and advises both public and private collections. Throughout his 40-plus career organizing exhibitions, Dan has steadfastly championed both the unexpected and under-recognized. We appreciate that. In 1982, he was the first American curator to organize a museum exhibition on LGBTQ art. And in 2008, he launched the Prospect New Orleans Triennial in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. Along the way, he's curated international biennials in Istanbul, Taipei, Ecuador, and Orange County, California, as well as many retrospectives of esteemed artists Carolee Schneemann, Paul McCarthy, Peter Saul, William Kentridge, Faye Ringgold, and goes on. Dan's core connection with art stems from his capacity to expand our collective awareness of ourselves, the world around us, and the way humans invent ways to communicate essential values with one another. Not only is art capable of changing the world, he believes, but it's also doing just that on a daily basis. I agree. That's nice. Gail Levin, down here on the end, our dear friend Gail. Gail is a distinguished professor of art history and American studies and women's studies at the Graduate Center at Baruch College of the City University of New York, the acknowledged authority on American realist painter Edward Hopper. Her work on 20th century and contemporary art has won international acclaim, been widely published and translated in Europe, Asia, and Australia. She has also focused on the art of Jewish women artists in their historical context. Her interest in women artists led to biographies on Judy Chicago, Lee Krasner, which is my favorite book, and also Teresa Bernstein. She's worked with us also on Sid Solomon, writing our essay for that show, and Lynn Drexler, who has sort of a similar market interest right now as Alice Baber. Gail Levin is not only a curator, but she shows her work as an artist and photographer. Last but not least, our new friend, Ann McCoy. We're so glad to meet Ann. Importantly, Ann knew Alice Baber, and so this is really so important for all of us. We're interested to hear what she has to say tonight about Alice, because these are the things that we don't know. Ann McCoy is a New York-based sculptor, painter, and art critic, and an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. She was awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in 2019. She taught art history in the graduate design section of the Yale School of Drama until May of 2020, and the art history department at Barnard College from 1980 through 2000. In addition to the Guggenheim, she has received the following awards: the Asian Cultural Council Award, the Pollock Krasner Foundation Award, the Gottlieb Foundation Award, the Award in Visual Arts, the Prix de Rome, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Ann McCoy's work is included in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Hirshhorn Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and among others. Anyway, Thank you all. I look forward to the panel tonight. I have a few questions myself, but maybe you can start by just talking about why you're here and your connection to Alice Baber.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to start because 40 years ago, I got a call. Did I know Alice Baber, or did I know her work? Was I aware that she had passed away the year before? And I said no, yes, and yes. Because at that time I was working for Tibor Denage, who had a gallery down the hall from A.M. Sachs, where Alice used to show, and word just got through the grapevine because back then there really weren't that many galleries, and everything was pretty much done around 57th Street. That resulted into something that was unique for me, which was the opportunity, the invitation to prepare Alice's papers, which had been accepted by the Smithsonian to form a core collection at the Archives of American Art forever as part of our nation's cultural patrimony. But largely due to her struggles with cancer, Alice had not had the opportunity to arrange them herself. So I had this honor really bestowed on me where, you know, having recently arrived in New York myself and I was aspiring to have a career in the art world myself, I got to sort of have a self-guided tour through the life, through the hallmarks of an artist who I really didn't know that well when I started. But by the time I finished, I felt was kind of like a big sister to me in a lot of ways because, you know, Alice didn't publish much, for example, but everything she published was substantive. She was a leader a lot in the art community. She was very much out in front in terms of advocating for galleries and sort of museum spaces to show more women artists than were being shown up until that time. And she had a very clear sense, I think, of her own position in art history and how her paintings kind of fit into a larger picture. There were other papers. There were lots of personal papers, lots of her own, you know, just checklists and preparing for shows, you know, the normal things that go into an artist's life. And there were a lot of personal papers as well. So I remember when I was being asked by the gallery to be involved in this project, I remember thinking that, you know, that I was having kind of conversations with Alice way back then because I got an insight into her private life, her struggles, her disappointments, some of the pain that was part of her life at that time. And I just felt like, wow, I really like this story to have a happy ending. You know, I was like rooting for Alice, you know, at the time. So, you know, I'm not an Alice Baber scholar, but I've always been extremely interested in the period in which she's working. So I felt like when I was invited, I could, you know, gather up enough credentials, let's say, at the moment, to hopefully contribute something that would be worth reading. But the thing that's very special to me about this is this kind of feeling of coming full circle. You know, that Alice has been gone now for just over 40 years. And maybe what's changed along the way is us, because I think that it really was difficult for the people of her time to see her work separate from everything else that was going around. You know, lyrical abstraction, sorry, someone's gonna need to use the phrase, so that's what we mean. That was a juggernaut at the time. That was sort of this all-consuming discourse in the art world. And Alice's work was not consistently perceived as separate from everything else that was going on. And now that that's long over and those arguments have all been fought, you know, I feel like we are now in a position to step back and see the work that Alice made with clear eyes, with a clear historical perspective. And so for that reason, I'm really happy and grateful that the gallery's done the exhibition. And I'm really happy to be here with my peers to talk about Alice.
Do I go in?
Please, Al.
Oh, I'm sitting here thinking Alice would have loved seeing this exhibition. I remember her last few shows, I think at Lillian Heidenberger and Abe Sachs, and they were, you know, in very small galleries, and she was sort of making the best of it. And if she had been here tonight, she would be so happy. This would have been Alice's dream. I knew Alice for 10 years. I met her when I was still in graduate school. she used to come out to Santa Barbara and stay with this wonderful banker who was a good friend of Mark Toby's, and sort of he was kind of the center of the Santa Barbara art scene. He would have these wonderful brunches. He was kind of a Southern gentleman. And Alice was making her living by doing all these kind of residencies and things for the government. And she didn't have money, and she would always stay at Charles Craig, sometimes for months. So that was sort of her base. And I also had known a lot of the other people that I met even when I was in graduate school, who were part of that École de Pacifique, who were people, like Claire Falkenstein. Alice knew Claire, and of course Sam Francis, the old devil, and Shirley Jaffe would also come out to Santa Barbara occasionally, and Joan Mitchell. Joan Mitchell's sister lived in Santa Barbara, and I'm just trying to think who else. So that there was a really pretty active involvement, and Zuka Mittelberg, who was also a good friend of Alice's. So that a lot of those artists had come from California, and they all hooked up in Paris in the 50s, and Alice was part of that group. It's too bad that when they did that show at the downtown at the Gray, that she wasn't included. Actually, she should have been. But I don't know. Alice was like her paintings. Alice had a wonderful femininity and a lightness about her. It was a wonderful kind of magical femininity. She was a great beauty to begin with. And there was a wonderful kind of light. I mean, she really had a kind of wonderful inner light. And she was an incredibly empathetic person. I met her at a really weird time in my life because I had just come out of the hospital out from an alcoholic suicide, and I was not in great shape. And then it was showing with, immediately in the art world, and so I was in a very strange state. And Alice was somebody who was very, very sympathetic to women, and she really understood how hard it was to be a woman artist, and she understood sort of the emotional perils. She was incredibly supportive to other women. And it's funny, I mean, I thought of Alice kind of like a sister. Oddly enough, I was in my 20s, and Alice was already in her 40s, and I never felt like she was older, I felt like we were sort of girls together. We would talk about our disastrous dating histories or, things like that. And she was interesting because she had a lot of depth. I mean, she would read things on Tibetan mysticism and Charles Craig too. I think she was also interested in Mark Toby. I don't know if she was really interested in Baha'i, but she was certainly interested in that type of thought. She wasn't really a New York school person. She wasn't part of the Clement Greenberg thing. I think, and she, in a strange way, she was also sort of kind of an odd member of the École Pacifique. I mean, I think that she, and I don't know, she really had a hard time in the art world too. I mean, she endured periods of incredible neglect. She had the misfortune of marrying this narcissistic asshole, Paul Jenkins, who kind of suffered from acute satyriasis, who was, I mean, he was, and he was, when you're leaving a narcissist, they can be really vicious, and he was pretty vicious. And I think Alice was very wounded. So it was a combination of an incredibly empathetic person and someone who'd also been kind of wounded. It was not easy in the art world for women. I mean, just look at the list of those Dorothy Miller shows, and you had to be an absolute ball buster. I mean, you had to be, a hard-drinking Joe Mitchell or Grace Hardigan, who could just really wrestle the guys under the table. I mean, and Alice wasn't. Alice was light-filled and feminine, and really, there was a wonderful vulnerability to her. I think I've talked enough. Let's go to Gail.
Beautiful snapshot.
I'd like to begin by thanking Dan Cameron for saving so many of Alice Baber's papers, which we now have focused in our yard, and helped me as I've been researching Alice Baber for a biography that is almost finished. And I'd like to thank Ann McCoy, who's also been open about speaking with me about Alice. and I would go through the papers that Dan saved, and I would see a letter signed Ann, and I would call up and say, Ann, is this you? And it was. So it's been a very lovely synergy. And I want to say, too, how wonderful it is to be at Mary Campbell with Christine Berry and Martha Campbell, whose career as dealers, also rediscovering so many women artists, I've followed since they were in their small gallery years ago, and brought my art market students and other students from Broome College, where Christine is a superstar. So it gives me great pleasure and to thank you again and to be here. So how I came to work on a biography of Alice Faber, well, I am a biographer pretty much after I learned about women artists. And I wrote on Paul Jenkins twice, and I knew him, interviewing him for the Lee Krasner biography, because Lee was a guest of he and his wife in Paris at the time Polly was killed in Carthage. And she got the news while she was visiting with Paul and Esther. So I needed to interview him. And he was charming, perfectly nice. And after he died, I ran into his widow, Suzanne Donnelly Jenkins, who had got into a conversation with me. I was working on Yasuo Komiyoshi, who had been Paul's most beloved teacher at the Art Students League. And I had been even working on him in a Fulbright in Japan. So we got to talking, and she asked me if I would write an essay on Paul's interest in Asian art, which I did, and it went fine. And then later, she asked me to write again for a show that was, Tampons in Florida. So I already knew Alice Faber, I already knew Paul Jenkins, and I knew there's a film about Paul Jenkins called The Ivory Knife, and I knew that the person who gave him the ivory knife was Alice Faber. But who was Alice Faber? She was not in any of the Paul Jenkins chronologies. And I wasn't doing a big project, just a catalog essay. So at the time, I knew earlier the name Alice Faber from the Alice Faber Memorial Library at Guildhall in East Hampton. And I had used that. It was just an art library of books that belonged to Alice Faber, whoever that was. I didn't really know. And that library has vanished. Not only the books have completely vanished without a list, but the space itself is no longer in Guildhall. And I remember the space. Then, in 2011, I actually published about Alice Faber without really noticing that I did, because I was researching the opening of a show at Usher Hall, a local community art center, which had a feminist art show, and Faber was a very important feminist. This was organized by my friend Joan Simmel and Joyce Haslam, two friends. And I tried to interview everyone that was in the show that was still alive, and including Gail Levin, and because that was where she did her very famous piece, Interior Scroll, where she pulled it out of her body. But so I mentioned Alice Faber, but I didn't have a clue that Alice Faber was the artist of these beautiful paintings. And then I also knew many of Alice Faber's friends, because she died in '82, and I moved out to East Hampton. I had a house out there from 1990. So I knew a lot of her friends who remembered her, but they weren't talking about her anymore. I mean, I'm sure they remembered her, but she wasn't showing. She did show at Elaine Benson Gallery out there, and I showed there, and I knew Elaine Benson. So Alice Faber was a conundrum for me. And as soon as I started to see her paintings, and also where they are in museums. So sometimes people make the mistake of saying Alice Faber was marginalized. I don't think that's true. I think she was on her way to really great recognition because she's in all the major museums in New York, every one of them. I mean, MoMA, Guggenheim, Metropolitan, Whitney with major paintings. And she's in all the major California museums with major paintings. So she simply died too soon in 1982, only 54 years old. And she had a history of travel and exhibition with a man she was with for a whole decade, not married to him that long, with him from 58 to 68. And they only married in 64. But she was erased from his chronologies, and to be fair, she never mentioned him after 64. He was erased from her chronologies too. But erasing, as a biographer, I know that an artist's work is involved with life and who they knew and context. And that makes Alice Bader very interesting also, because she was very active at the club on A Street, and also its later incarnation. And she was present at the Cedar Bar when she got asked to be in a co-op gallery on 10th Street. And she was showing with Elaine de Kooning, and even at the co-op gallery, the Orange Gallery. So it's kind of a dramatic situation to me that Alice has vanished so much without a trace. And I have to give Martha and Christine a lot of credit for bringing her back and making this beautiful show. And I have to say that gradually, it really has felt, writing her biography, like I'm in an archaeological dig and I'm getting little pottery shards. But gradually I've gotten together and I can see the picture on the vase. And I'm really getting to understand Alice Bader. I think she is extremely original. I do know, I think more than anybody in this room, her early work, which I'm going to save as a surprise for the biography, when she was still a figure, pretty much vanished. But she's very original, I'll say that. And we're not talking about the childhood yet, that's another, I'll stop.
Well, actually, Gail, I thought you would segue maybe naturally into her childhood a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, because then I know you have things, I know that Ann, you've prepared some ideas about color as well, or those
Well, I
experiences.
didn't prepare anything, but I've been living with Alice rather intensely for the last year.
If you wouldn't mind.
And I have to say, to live with an artist as a biographer can be hell or pleasure. And it is so wonderful to be writing about someone everybody loved. I haven't found anybody to say anything bad about Alice Bader. And even her ex-husband had nice things to say about her afterwards. So it's been fascinating. So her childhood, and I'm going to save some of it for the biography, but her father was really quite a special man, an intellectual, and he was actually descended from Abraham Lincoln's mother, so from Lincoln, and very proud of it, and he wrote sort of self-published books, but a lot of them about Nancy Hanks, Lincoln's mother, who was also a relative of Nancy Hanks, the second head of the National Endowment for the Arts, and Alice's first cousin. But I can get into the repercussions of that later. But to talk about, Alice is famous for having left rural Illinois. She was born in Charleston, Illinois. It's really small, near the Indiana border. And she grew up some in Paris, Illinois, and Kansas, Illinois, where she went to high school. But the story is, and it's not quite the whole story, the story is she has severe bronchitis. And so from the age of 2, and she had an older sister too, the family went to Florida for every winter, and then came back to Illinois for the summers. And her mother had this huge family. Her father's wasn't that as big, but it was big. So she had all these cousins. Alice was, I would say, very sociable from everything I've read. She was beautiful, as I think Ann remarked. Everybody agrees about that. And she was very gracious, and people just only say nice things about her. But she, the family wasn't wealthy, but they were landowners. And they had inherited a 19th century farmhouse on her father's side. But when the mother took them every winter to Florida, because the father actually stayed down there running a feed store, which is what his father did pretty much, like agricultural feed. And they camped in a tent on the way to Florida. In fact, they stopped in Atlanta, my hometown. So I remember the funniest things. But Alice, from the age of 5, very influenced by her intellectual father, said she couldn't decide whether she was going to become a poet or a painter. And she wrote all this poetry. And you know, it is, look at around you, it's already about color from the age of 5. And she wrote it herself. There are, for example, she might write a bicycle pedal or a flower petal, but she was spelling. She liked letters. She was obviously very precocious. And she was writing about color and nature. And her father was also writing about nature. And she had a reverence for nature, which I think really comes all the way through to her mature painting. And the other thing is that I learned reading, and I don't know if anybody here besides Ann knew her, or if you've ever heard her say what is in her, it's in a sort of publication from her estate, that she claimed to have been part Cherokee Indian, Native American. You heard that? So she wrote poetry already as a child about Indians, and her father wrote about Native Americans. And so she's a very special character. And it doesn't surprise me that she was really an American original and came out with these a unique body of art, where she's not like everybody. Her contemporaries were, her exact contemporary was Helen Franklin, and they knew each other slightly, but she's not really characterized as an abstract expressionist, and the art is something else. And I agree with you, Dan, I don't think she's really a lyrical abstractionist quite either. That term, by the way, is, I would say, misused. And of course, the New York Times, in a review of the Larry Aldrich collection of the Whitney in 1971, and it also appears in Alice's New York Times obituary. But it's a misnomer, and it doesn't do her justice. And I don't actually agree with you that she was a holistic, although she's certainly regret.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I think that for Alice, I think her childhood was in nature, but also her I wrote a piece. It was the first piece of art criticism, or first article on an artist I ever wrote in 1980 in Art International, and it was also, I spoke to Alice a great deal. I just started teaching in the art history department at Barnard, but I spoke to Alice a great deal. I had to, because my specialty is Native American, or was then, so this was a real point of departure for me. So I had long conversations with Alice, and Alice's childhood was very important. She talked a lot about light, and she would describe this green light and sort of patterns coming through the leaves onto the wall of her bedroom. So she was very, very involved with kind of this kind of optical world. And in a strange way, I think of her almost more in terms of filmmaking in a strange way. That's why in this piece I wrote, I compared her, the only person I could think of who really used light or saw light in that way was this filmmaker Stan Brakhage, whom I had known as a child, in his Text of Light, where he was very involved with light. He took a camera and a ray of light coming through a glass ashtray that broke up the prisms. And I think that spiritually too, there's a whole spiritual dimension to Alice. I've always been interested in prismatics, whether it's Newton's prismatics or Athanasius Kircher with where he was breaking up light. And I think that for me, Alice's paintings, she always said that there was light inside of each space. And if you look at these paintings, there's no light source. So that they exist in a field, and it's a different kind of space. It's almost like a kind of space you get in film, projected film, or a kind of holographic space. And she spoke about that a lot. The shapes were very intentional. She thinned the paint down and did it with her finger. She wasn't using a brush. And she always said to me that each shape contained its own light source. And I said holographic because the thing that I find interesting about Ann Brackage's film too, Text of Light, is that it is like a holographic universe because you see in front of the shape, you see behind the shape, through the shape. They float in a way, and for me that's interesting because I think that Alice was really unique in this. I mean, she's not like Morris Louis. She's not Paul Jenkins. She's not even Sam Francis. She's not these people who are there. There's an incredible transparency to this, and there's nothing accidental. There's nothing accidental. This is incredibly intentional with her finger. I keep thinking. I mean, if I had a dream exhibition that I could curate, it would be to place Alice's paintings in and have something like the Kurt Schwarzfeder light box that was really just reconstructed by the microscope gallery, where this from 1922, where he projected light and all of these life forms, and where you have color that comes out in the same way, or even the Thomas Wilford color organ. I think that this is a kind of projected color that we see. I mean, it's interesting with the Harry Smith show recently, you get that with the hand-painted works of Harry Smith, and also even Brackage's hand-painted thing. That I think that these shapes remind me more of the kind of shape that you see in film, where it's the transparency and the way the shapes float in space. I think this is really kind of her unique contribution. She was also very metaphysical. I mean, she said she read widely. She didn't go to an ashram or anything like that. I don't think she sort of read widely, everything from, I think she was interested in Tibetan, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, I remember. And she was interested too, through Charles Craig. Charles Craig was a collector and great friend of Mark Tobey. And Alice said that her use of light was really not a kind of light where she would, like Manet or something, and go and set up her easel in front of a church and paint it with all the different types of light. She would have an experience of light, like she did in her cot, looking at the light through the leaves. Or she went to Machu Picchu, she went different places, and she would have kind of a memory of the light from a place. So that I think that's a fascinating idea to me as an artist myself. I can't imagine doing that, having a kind of, memory of the light of a place and then reproducing it. So, I mean, I know, as I said, it's weird. I wrote this piece in 1980, it was the first piece of writing I ever did on an artist, and I didn't do hardly any writing till 2013. So this was, I think it was, it's really depressing. I mean, I'm an expert on William Kentridge, among other things. And, when I'm working on Kentridge, I mean, Kentridge has a shelf of books this big, or if I'm working on Wadichko, if I'm working on, and then I'll find a brilliant genius like Lean Alon, one self-published manuscript, maybe a horrible art news article or a bad Art in America article, of, you know, a couple dog-eared catalogs. That in the art, that's why I started writing at the Brooklyn Braille, because no one, I exist in a historical black hole. No one writes about women artists. Thank God for people like Gail, because women artists have so much less ink. I mean, it's really, really important that all of these women critics and women writers do this. And this is very much in the spirit of Alice. She was out there helping so many people. She was so empathetic. I mean, I stayed with her many times. Went to the Hamptons where she would go out and stay with Jim Jones, Mr. From Here to Eternity. You know, she was very good friends of Jim and Gloria Jones from her Paris days. But I think she always had, you know, people staying in there.
Actually, she lived in New York before she went to Paris.
She what? She met them in New York before Paris?
But I'm interested in this idea, not to cut off that line of thinking, but I do, just so everyone knows, when I was starting to write about Alice, I struggled with the notion of her lack of recognition today, her lack of visibility today. And I began to slowly dissuade myself from the idea that even though she lived in New York, and New York was her base, and New York was where she made all her accomplishments, she was not part of the New York school. And I think you made that very, very clear. So I began to think about the international basis of how she was working, how, you know, the way abstract painting in Paris in the 50s, post-war painting, artists like Riopelle that we don't really think of today, Nay. And then I got deeper into her writing and realized that Sonia Delaunay, the Orphism, as we know it, and their effort to create a form of a metaphysical abstraction, but using a very, I'm going to say, stripped down palette. You know,
Because she
primary
wrote on Sonia
colors.
Delaunay.
That was her main source of historical, how can I say, rooting herself. And then I read your article, Ann, and that made it all make sense, because Ann wrote this article in Art International that finally tied Alice Baber to what I thought was the most unexpected connection, which were her generation of light and space artists, artists who made their work not necessarily using painting, where the color and the light came through in other ways. And so I feel like as I'm trying to understand how we can appreciate the Alice that is in front of us now, I think we have to sort of think more in this cosmopolitan idea that we have now, where artists can have one foot in Paris and have one foot in light and space work and still be in New York and be part of all of these different worlds at the same time, but be stylistically unique.
I want to propose, I interviewed Sonia Delaunay twice, and 1976 and 75 and 77, I think. I photographed her. But I don't really think that Alice was exactly influenced by Sonia Delaunay, but I would rather say that there was more of a confluence. So I think they had a lot in common. And Alice makes a point, at one point she wanted to work from a figure. This is early in the 50s in New York. And she goes over to Hans school. And she rejects that because she sees him correcting, which of course bothers me. Grasser also working on a student's work without permission. But she also said he was selling, and it's true, a kind of cubism, and she rejected that. And Sonia Delaunay and Romeo Delaunay do come out of cubism, but they bring light and color to it. But I would propose that by the time she writes in 73 about Sonia Delaunay, and she was introduced by another artist to represent Buffy Johnson. Oh, yeah. Okay, I've seen her. So I think there were a number of shows together.
Yes.
So they have to confluence, but I don't see her the Delanays as a major influence. And I
The
also,
watercolors, though, I remember her talking about the Sonia Delaney watercolors, and I think this is kind of a funny thing, but I remember there was a restorer or somebody that a lot of art collectors don't know that watercolor fades, and I remember Alice saying that someone had placed like a great Sonia Delaney watercolor, like, facing a window, and the whole thing had faded. So I know she was aware of watercolors.
she was absolutely aware of Sonia Delaney's work and Robert Delaney, and I think she appreciated it. But I don't see it, I don't think her work comes out of it.
I agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with
But I
you.
think it's worth considering, and certainly they showed together, and I remember they're in a show in England, even, during Alice's lifetime, when she was in England. So, yeah.
I remember she was fascinating. Jim Terrell lived on, Alice would come down to LA periodically, and with Charles Craig usually, and Charles Craig was a friend of Dwayne Valentine's, but I remember she was fascinating because Jim Terrell had a studio on Market Street, and it was like a white box with a hole, kind of like a camera obscura, and the light from the street lights, the cars and stuff would come through and make dots in this white space. And so Alice knew about that, and she certainly knew Dwayne Valentine. She would come down there. So she knew some of those California artists, and that's the other thing about her. She was very open. I think she probably would have been more interested in people like that than some of the New York school. She was always interested in sort of unusual things like that.
Well, I think Alice was a very important feminist and actually responded in certain ways to feminist art. I don't mean just art by feminists, but feminist art. And if you have any ear, she did a lot of paintings with an X, and X with a circle in the center. And actually, it's fascinating to read the New York Times reviews of a couple of the guys that wrote about Alice in detail. They're very, very sexist in a shocking way. I mean, they were positive reviews, basically, if you don't mind the heavy load of sexism. But one of them, let's see, it's James Mello and another one, I'm not remembering the name right now, but one of them is very nervous about the X configuration. And why would he be nervous? If you look at Miriam Shapiro's feminist art, she does the big X, the orange X, with a circle in the center. And Alice did a lot of those configurations. They don't look like Miriam Shapiro, but they have this outline. And Miriam called that her cut painting. In other words, it's supposed to represent woman and woman's inner space. And Hannah Wilkie has that discussion too in Chicago, so forth. But Alice is the model of discretion, and she also, remember Betty Friedan talked about the lavender menace, and it was anti-lesbian? Alice, before that, had already done a lot of lavender title paintings. She continues after that, and she says, Alice says one of her biggest interests is metaphor. So there's no way she missed the connection to Betty Friedan, and that Alice is being, she was heterosexual, but she's being very supportive of her feminist colleagues who were lesbians. And I believe she's speaking up for them in the face of Betty Friedan's condemnation, excuse me. And Alice was somebody who really cared about other artists and community. And by the way, she didn't just write about Sonia Delaney, but color, but also she curated, or was assistant curator and also curator. For example, she did a big essay on our show, Rookies Color. And it's very good. And she actually owned an Orchard drawing, she said. So, oh, and I wanted to say one more thing. Alice Baber has a new model for being an artist. After her divorce from Paul Jenkins, she tries getting teaching jobs and she succeeds, but she did not actually finish her master's degree, so she could never get a tenured position. No matter how many shows she had, academia doesn't quite work that way. But Alice was so personable and a wonderful speaker, and the United States used to have a program to send artists and speakers, even like me, abroad to talk about American culture. I did it a little bit, kind of ended with Glasnow's around 1990. It was called USIA or USIS,
Yes.
depending on if it was from here or what you did.
Yes.
So Alice went to Iran, to India, and all over Latin America. And one of the things, she collected crafts, especially women's crafts.
Her loft was chock full of that stuff. Absolutely chock full of that stuff.
But anyway, they pay you, if you remember, per diem.
Yeah.
And your expenses, your travel expenses. So this was another way. And Alice had shows. In fact, when she died, there were still circulating shows of her work.
In embassies throughout Central America.
Yeah, not just in embassies, but cultural
And
centers.
cultural centers.
All over the Caribbean was posthumous. So Alice kind of invented, and she was perfect for the USIA. The art is politically unobjectionable. Even the feminists, which you can't see it, it's discreet. And they're beautiful. And Alice's only politics were really feminists. And they didn't send her to Saudi Arabia where women couldn't drive. And when they sent her to Iran, it was under the Shah, it was more liberal. And so Alice was perfect.
I don't think she was really, I don't think she was involved with feminist iconography in that way, but she was certainly very, very supportive of all kinds of women. I was in, sort of that consciousness raising thing then in Los Angeles, and she was involved with it in New York, and I would be coming back and forth. So I was actually involved with people like Mary Beth Edelson and that kind of thing. I don't remember Alice being involved in that group of women at all, but she certainly was supportive of women, and she organized those exhibitions of women.
And when she was asked specifically in an interview, why do you do those X configurations? She said, because I do like them.
It's actually, we just have time for a few questions. I can listen to, Gail and Ann do my bit, but really, I'm sure some of you have come with wanting more information, some questions, ideas of your own, maybe some feedback about Alice Baber. Would anyone like to grab a microphone?
Yes. A question about the end of her. How did she die and where was she working? And I'm just curious, how did her career?
It was very sad. I wrote that piece for Art International in 1980, and it was the first major piece written about her during her lifetime. And then Alexandria Lally, some people wrote some things after she died, but she felt neglected, and it was very sad because she'd had a melanoma and it came back, and at the end of her life was really awful because she was in this halo, because she was in a halo that supported her head, and a kind of a harness thing with a halo, and it was really sad. It was so sad. It was the fact the last year or so was just awful.
And there were reviews of her work. If you go through, you can find very positive commentary, but as far as feature art?
No, there's a wonderful feature art, by the way, but there's another wonderful one by James Jones.
Of course.
Jim Jones, Mr. From Here to Eternity.
Yes, and actually, it's reprinted in Marlene Boucher's book, 25 Artists, and I made the same mistake your gallery did at first, because they misdated it to 63. but it really came out at 65. But it took me a long time to figure it out.
Wow, that's amazing, yeah.
There were a lot of things that are hard to sort out.
Where her paintings were with her husband, or
I remember when she got,
safe, or were they kept in storage? Like, I'm curious, they were.
I took Donald McKinney from Nerdlers to her loft right after she died, trying to get Nerdlers to pick up the lot, and they didn't. But I think, I mean, her sister scattered a lot of sort of out in the Hamptons and for benefits kind of thing. They were,
Not her sister,
You would know more.
Her sister. It was, there were auctions and they were raising money for the Alice Baber Memorial Collection in Guildhall. They had about, was it 8 or 9 pictures there?
There was an auction in Vermont. Somebody got a batch of paintings and they were dispersed early on and nobody cared, so they were sold for nothing. But obviously, they're turning out, but it's different from it's different. You know, usually Martha and I work with the state, so this has been interesting for us to actually have to collect. That's why I say collect up. We've had interest in this for a long time. And it's sad. She died young, and people around her passed, and there was no one to take care of. So that's the hard part of that story.
And I would say, I mean, working at it more from the history angle like Gail, it's undoubtedly true that there are Babers out there circulating that haven't really been identified yet. This is what happens, you know, and this is now the process where you cast the net and you slowly bring it back to some
In the art
central.
fields and that.
Yeah.
And especially the
And it's also the case that Baber has been discovered online. You can now buy Baber t-shirts, Baber backpacks, Baber articles, Baber, yeah, it's really, and it's, I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I first saw it, but I decided that Alice would be very pleased that people love these images. They are so perfect in the bad and mid-century design.
Yeah.
And so people are reproducing them. You know, I'm not saying it's wrong, but there's no one policing it.
I think, I mean, in a sad, you know, she was just asking about Alice's end. And I mean, it was a horrible cancer, but in a strange way, I think that Alice really, you know, I think the art world kind of killed her off in a strange way too. I mean, I remember talking to Claire Falkenstein, who'd also been part of that group in Paris, and she said it was just wall-to-wall misogyny, that all of those people were total shits. And that it was such a hard time, and Alice really, I mean, she would go on and on about, you know, why am I not having the kind of attention that Helen Frankenthaler did? And I felt like saying, because you didn't fuck Clement Greenberg. Oh, no, you. But it was really hard, you know, because unless you were sleeping with your dealer or had a lot of family money or that kind of thing, I mean, it was really rough. I mean, Joan Mitchell and Helen Frankenthaler were rich, you know, and Alice was doing all of these residencies. And she did not have money. I mean, I remember she would give me lectures like, always buy a large box of powdered milk because it doesn't spoil and you can get it and keep it in your loft. You know, she had all these kind of money-saving tips. You know, people forget that women, a lot of women did not have it easy.
I would also venture to propose that Alice had an extremely powerful spiritual inner life, that she was very clear on what she was doing, and it sustained her. Even though all of this is true, she would sustain, it wasn't so much the belief that she was a great artist or something like that she wasn't that egotistical. She was sustained by a spiritual belief that what she's doing was worthwhile.
She really
that she
knew
was
it.
making
Absolutely. She totally knew
and
that
that
what she
always
was
came
doing.
through. I always felt that.
And there was a real inner light. I mean, there was real, it's like her forms contained light. She did too. She was a very spiritual person.
She actually studied Zen, which was common.
When she was in Japan,
No, later, the 50s at the club. And Columbia, she went to courses. And then she studied Hindu, Vedanta.
That's right, I remember that now. God, I'd forgotten that, because I was a friend of Christopher Isherwood's, and he had translated the Crest Jewel and written a book about Ramakrishna, and in fact, I used to drive him to the Vedanta Society in Los Angeles, but she was interested in Vedanta, and there was a Vedanta temple in LA, but there was one up in Ojai. There was kind of California was sort of a hotbed for those sorts of spiritual things.
Was?
Is.
I know, but
No, but it particularly was.
It was been.
the tradition with Marston Buckley in the East, much earlier, with Vivekananda. And then that's the society she studied with.
Any other questions? I think this is, we have a couple back.
So I wonder if you could say some more about how she painted. I think someone mentioned that she sometimes finger painted, which I wasn't aware. Did she outline with her finger? Was it basically
No.
a brush?
I mean, I saw her work. Is that helpful? No, she thinned the paint out, and she used I think her index finger usually.
She called it lifting and sinking.
Yeah, she used her finger, and she didn't use a brush. I mean, it wasn't like a poured, like the stain, like Morris Louis or Jenkins. It was her finger, and it was very, and she really worked the shapes in an incredible way. There's nothing accidental about these shapes.
That's amazing for a larger canvas too.
And I'm guessing no gloves.
Oh, no.
No.
I think so.
Next question.
Well, thank you all for all that you shared. It's so great to learn about Alice. I have a question for you, Anne. As a friend of hers, I was curious to know if you were aware of her poetry and her kind of work with words, and if you could speak at all to, Alice having an interest in poetry. We noticed a lot of very beautiful, poetic, intriguing titles of these pieces. And
I do remember reading her poetry. She had a lot of kind of loose notes and loose, I mean, it wasn't like in a book. I don't think it was, I don't remember it being in even a fountain. I mean, I remember it kind of on scraps of things, as I remember. But it's been, as I said, it's been 40 years. But I do remember her reading poetry or talking about poetry. It was very important to her. It was another part of her life.
There was some small condition, very small. And she had many poet friends, James Schuyler, Richard Howard, John Ashbery, all wrote about her.
That's right, she's in
And Rose Lipka was a poet and painter show. Rose Lipka, who was her editor for Sunday Morning and Grand Rising. But Alice adored literature, period. So I don't want to say about that. Thank you.
Well, I've had an amazing evening talking with Ann, talking with Gail, really getting to know Alice Baker a little bit better. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and Christine and Martha for bringing us all together. Everyone have a great evening and enjoy the show.